everybody. This is Ryan Hale with Fruition Partners. With me, I have Rob Ballin. He's going to be doing the presentation, basically of order guide, best practices, and service catalog administration. He is our service catalog expert. And what I'm here to do is introduce you guys all to Rob, and then also give a little bit of background as far as the history of Fruition Partners, and a little snapshot as far as what we do. So we were founded basically in 2003, 7 years ago. There's about 40 consultants, and we work primarily in the U.S., but also have a few international clients. And everybody that works for Fruition Partners is ITIL Foundation certified under version 3, and we also go all the way up to service management. And then our technical consultants are experts in their field. So we like to think of ourselves basically as an ITSM one-stop shop. We do education, consulting, and on the ServiceNow side, we'll also do some virtual administration, and that kind of gets us into the complete IT service integration, which builds on the three things that I just spoke to, which is the education, administration, and customization. And we do that not only with ServiceNow, but also with ITSM. And on this note, it's the agenda for the slide deck, so I'm going to hand it over to Rob, and he will take you through order guide best practices.
Hi, my name is Rob Ballin, and as Ryan said, I am the Service Catalog expert at Fruition Partners. Today we're going to be going over the order guide, some best practices. We'll start with an overview of what an order guide actually is. We'll go into when you should use an order guide and what's the type of situations. We'll also go into some typical uses or some uses that we've seen order guides used in. We'll also go into, from an administrator perspective, of how to maintain an order guide. We will then go into a live example of an out-of-box order guide that's set up in everybody's instance, the new hire. We will go into a couple scripting examples, some ones that we found have been very useful, and then we'll have some best practice suggestions for it. So we'll start with an overview of what an order guide actually it is. Essentially, it's a mechanism to allow for one or many items to be ordered on a single request. What makes it unique is the ability to have the end user either knowingly or unknowingly select which items are actually needed as part of the request. You can have items defaulted in, or you can have them up front in front of the user and allowing them to select. Each item in an order guide can have its own workflows. Workflows can also be shared across multiple items. And basically you can ask questions that are relevant to each item in an order guide up front, so it allows for an easier user experience when submitting a request. So now we'll touch on when to use order guides. We typically see these used in situations where many items can be ordered. Order guides are used to arrange commonly requested items or grouping, and presents them all to the user basically up front. We also use these in situations where we want to enhance UI. When there's many questions to be answered, and that information that has been gathered can be used across multiple items, it's best to use an order guide. That way you don't have to ask the user multiple times for basically the same information. We've also used these when grouping is necessary. It allows for grouping of similar items, and it ends up being more of a categorization in the service catalog. You'll see in a later example. So we'll start with some typical uses for order guides and where we've seen order guides used effectively. Prime example is the new employee hire. Basically what an order guide allows you to do is provide a standardization on the onboarding process. You can ask all the questions up front of job description, maybe their location, department. All of those type of questions can lead into what items are actually submitted with the order. Again, you can have items defaulted in, or you can ask up front which type of items are needed. And it basically allows for a customized request. Sometimes we see a hiring manager in charge of submitting the request, so maybe they don't know all of the items that the person might need. So it kind of defaults in the items that are required for the new hire to actually do their job. Again, it allows for a bundling of these related items, and as I mentioned, these departments and or locations can be the conditions that are used to determine which items are actually included as part of this request. Another use that we've seen a lot is the hardware request. Basically, it provides a central point from where all hardware can be ordered from. Again, you can ask questions that limit the number of options that are available to the end user. So instead of having the user select all the pieces, because typically what you do is when you ask the question of what do you need, it typically turns out to I need it all. So this way you can kind of limit it down to what do they actually need to do their job effectively. And again, it eliminates the need for creating a separate request for each piece of hardware. Another place where we commonly see order guides used for are for access and software requests. As you see at the bottom here, we have what is called the list collector variable. It basically allows for the end user to select one or many pieces of software. Each software option in that list collector has an item behind it. So depending on which items are actually selected, brought from the left to the right, those will be the items that are included with the order guide. Again, each item has the ability to have its own workflow, and we typically use order guides for these type of requests because most pieces of software have the same or very similar questions. And if you're ordering, say, 5 pieces of software and you're answering the same question multiple times, it doesn't really make much sense. So putting all of the similar questions up front again allows for an easier user experience. So now we're going to step into an administrator's shoes for setting up and maintaining an order guide. There are 2 things that are unique about the order guide form as you see below, one of them being the 2-step checkout. Now the 2-step checkout, if that is set to true, the last step in the ordering process is skipped. That last step is actually a view of the current shopping cart, and it allows you basically to review what is currently in your shopping cart before submitting the request. The second thing that is unique about order guides is the idea of cascading variables. Now the idea behind that is when you ask these questions up front, it allows for the values that were filled in by the end user to be cascaded or transferred from that first page to the actual item level. And that again allows for an expedited submittal process. Variables on order guides are very similar to how they are on items. The same options are available. One thing to keep in mind on an order guide is the idea of that cascading that I mentioned earlier. How that works is it actually looks at the variables that are in the total request, and if the names match up, then that information or that value that was filled in by the end user gets transferred across all variables with the same name. A tip here would be to use variable sets. That basically allows for you to utilize a set of variables across multiple items. Now if you assign that variable set to an order guide, since the names are all the same, the information comes across from the order guide to all the associated items that get ordered. The part that makes order guides unique when compared to items is the idea of rule bases. Now rule bases are what define what can be ordered from an order guide. The items can have, as we mentioned earlier, be defaulted in, or they can be conditionally set. Look into what a typical rule base is made out of. Again, they can be conditional. In this example, if the end user selects one of these titles, CEO, CFO, CTO, or Director, and has a department of IT, then include the executive desktop. This is an example of an item that is defaulted in. Or you can put the questions up front and have those items be selected by the end user directly. We are now going to step through the out-of-box order guide for new employee hire. As you see here on the first panel, it appears to be very similar to an item, but there are multiple items in the background that are associated with this order guide. So we'll go through and create John Smith's new employee hire request. Let's say he is going to be our new CEO, and he's going to be part of our IT department. As you might remember in the earlier example of rule bases, we have some items that are going to be defaulted in here. Based on his title and his department, that executive desktop will be a part of this order. You'll see that on the next screen. We also ask some questions right up front here for additional services. And what this is referring to are additional items that are going to be a part of this order. Let's say John Smith needs an iPhone 3G and some business cards. The next step of the order guide is to choose the options. Now this page, as you see, has the actual items listed on the top in separate tabs. Each item has the ability to have their own set of questions. They can share similar data as far as who their request is for, or what location these items are going to go to. So I can customize my executive desktop. Alright. The next tab refers to the iPhone 3G. This is an option that I've selected on that first page. I needed an iPhone 3G. Executive desktop, as you might remember, is a piece or an item that has been defaulted in based on our selections. The next piece here, and you see this little star here, that denotes that there is a mandatory field that needs to be filled out in order to submit this request. And job title, CEO. Also, street address. So now, the last step of the order guide is to check out. Again, this is the third step of the order guide. It allows you to see which items are a part of your shopping cart at the current time. You can also have prices associated with each item, and it kind of gives you a grand total of how much your complete request costs. You can submit any special requirements or instructions, and also this would be the point where you can actually add an attachment to your order. So go ahead and submit the order. It'll bring me to my last screen, which is basically a summary of the request as a whole. As you see, I ordered a business card, an executive desktop, and an iPhone 3G. Lays out some stages for each item, and again, once these get completed, based on the workflow, they will be checked off in green after it gets approved as well. So we're now going to go through some of the commonly used client scripting with order guides. As you see here, a common request is allowing the variable set to be transferred across many items. It might become a little overwhelming when you have the same questions visible, even though they're answered, but having them visible on the item might become a little overbearing for the end user. So this simple onload client script actually removes the variable set that you name based on where it's at along the process. And basically what it does, it looks for the described needs on the banner, which is that second step. Another common request when working with order guides is the ability to allow for some categorization at the request level. The idea behind that is if you're looking at a list of requests that are open, without actually digging into the open request, you wouldn't really know where the order or the request actually came from. This piece of script here is a way to actually push the name of the order guide through the script include that actually is part of the shopping cart. This is an out-of-box script include that when a request is submitted, you add a couple lines of code and you can grab the actual guide or the order guide name and paste it to a newly created field. We now have some best practice suggestions when dealing with order guides. The first one is the idea of create order guides out of items that can also be ordered individually. Now the reasoning behind that is to allow for more flexibility in your service catalog without repeating the same type of work. A good example of what we mean by standalone items is, say, a laptop. Now when you create a laptop item, you're probably thinking, well, I want it in the new user order guide, but I also want it in the hardware order guide. So you'll ask questions that are relevant to just the laptop on that item. Even though you're going to be using it in the new user and you're going to be using it in the hardware, make sure you ask all the questions related to the new user on the first page of the order guide and leave the item level for more specific variables for that item. Another suggestion is create order guides that are visually similar. So basically you want to have some type of uniformity in your service catalog. So if you're going to ask a series of questions related to the actual requester that is going to be filling out the form, you want to ask all those questions up front. And if you're going to be using a different order guide, make sure that those always stay at the top of the order guide. So there's some uniformity across the board for your service catalog. Another suggestion would be to always name your variables. Again, this allows for scripting of the variables. And it also allows for the workflow to be dependent on what has been selected. So you can actually script the workflow to be dependent on what has been selected up front. And the only way to allow that is to name your variables. Another suggestion is use the request for widget. The request for widget allows for the end user to select on a per item basis or per order guide basis who the request is actually for. It allows for some security on who can actually submit on behalf of someone else, and that type of configuration is set up in the properties for the service catalog. Thank you very much for joining in today, and take care.